Good morning. I'm Rob Ellsworth from the Committee on House Administration. On behalf of Chairman Vern Ehlers of Michigan and Senator Trent Lott, it's an honor to welcome you to the 2006 Congressional Intern Lecture Series. Today's speaker, Charlie Cook, is editor and publisher of the Cook Political Report and a political analyst for the National Journal Group, where he writes weekly for National Journal Magazine and Congress Daily AM. He also writes a regular column for the Washington Quarterly, published by the Center for Strategic and International Studies, and is a political analyst for NBC News. Widely regarded as one of the nation's leading authorities on U.S. elections and political trends, Charlie Cook has appeared on the ABC, CBS, and NBC evening news programs, as well as on Good Morning America, The Today Show, Nightline, Meet the Press with Tim Russert, and This Week. He's also appeared many times on CNBC, MSNBC, CNN, C-SPAN, CNN, and National Public Radio. Before joining the National Journal Group in 1998, Charlie Cook wrote for 12 years a twice-weekly column in Roll Call. He's also served as election night analyst for CBS and NBC since 1990. The New York Times has called Charlie Cook one of the best political handicappers in the nation and noted that the Cook Political Report is a newsletter that both parties regard as the authoritative Bible of the political community. It is an honor to introduce Mr. Charlie Cook.
Thank you. Thank you very much for that nice introduction. I apologize for being late. I was doing a radio interview on the other side of town. It took a little while to get over here. Well, first of all, I used to sit where you sat. I was an intern on the Hill back in 1973 and 74, and actually 75 as well. So, and I remember going to these programs and how interesting it was. And I got bit by the bug like I'm sure a lot of you have gotten. Maybe I should move this thing down. It's a little feedback here. If I can get it off my shirt. Here we go. Let's try this. Is that better? Can you hear okay? Okay, good. Anyway, so welcome to Washington. You're here at a really odd time where there's sort of like a lot of high nerves that on the Republican side, it's gosh, can we hold on to the House? Can we hold on to the Senate? On the Democratic side, it's kind of like, I don't know how many of you watched the old Peanuts cartoon, but there used to be, Charlie Brown would always try to, kick the football. And Lucy would hold the football for him, and just as Charlie Brown would rear back to kick it, she'd pull it out and he'd fall flat on his rear end. And Democrats are wondering, are we going to fall flat on our rear end again, or is this time we're actually going to get a majority back? So it's kind of this interesting push-pull. I only know of, and I have this kind of an odd, okay, yeah, and also turn this like that might help too. I have kind of this weird, kind of a love-hate relationship with the 2006 election, and I know that sounds weird, but I'm probably an odd person to boot. But on the one hand, I mean, gosh, the House is teetering on the edge. Senate, it could turn over to, all this focus on congressional elections, midterm elections. That's what I do for a living. Gosh, I should love it. And in a lot of ways, I do. I mean, it's sort of validating when there's a big focus on what you do for a living. But on the other hand, I hate it because I'm supposed to have a really good idea what's going to happen, since this is what I do for a living. And I'm really torn because I only know of two ways to analyze congressional elections, midterm elections. And one is what I would call the macro approach, M-A-C-R-O, and the other is the micro, M-I-C-R-O. Now, the macro political approach is where you look at national polls, you look at the national political climate, you look at historical precedent, and you sort of extrapolate out from that what you think is going to happen in the congressional elections. Then there's the micro approach. Do you think I ought to use that instead? Let's try this. Let me turn this off first. Where did I put it? Here. Sorry. That's all right. Okay, let's just try it like this first. This work better? No feedback? Okay. Like Phil Donahue. The second is the micro approach, where you look at each of the 435 House races independently, each of the 33 Senate races, each of the 36 governor's races individually, and kind of analyze each one, and then sort of total it up and see what you get. And when you look at the macro approach, when you look at the national polls, political climate, historical precedent, this is going to be like the apocalypse for Republicans. It's just an absolutely horrendous election. You know, there's no way they hold on to the House, the Senate. Gosh, it could very well be gone too. It just couldn't be worse. But then when you look at it, the micro, it kind of pulls it back a good bit. And what it says is, well, you know, there are structural forces that are sort of helping Republicans hold on to their majority and offsetting some, not saying all, or even necessarily most, but some of those environmental advantages that are helping Democrats right now, to the point where, you know, the House, I think, is a reasonably close call. There are days and weeks when I think the Democratic chances of taking the House back are higher than 50-50, and then there are times when it's been lower. It's been going back and forth, you know, all year, for example. So the macro is just this enormous tidal wave, and the micro is, well, Republicans suffer a bunch of losses, but they probably retain, you know, they have a 50-50 chance of retaining the House, and in all probability will retain their majority in the Senate as well. Well, which is it? Well, let's talk about each one. In the House, on the macro level, the 4 poll questions that I look at to sort of ascertain, okay, what's the political climate like? Is it level? Is it a fair fight? Is it tilted slightly towards one party? Is it tilted a lot towards one party? Is it like almost, you know, almost vertical, where there's just this overwhelming advantage for one party or the other? The 4 poll questions I look at most closely are, number 1, right direction, wrong track. Do you think the country is headed in the right direction, or do you think it's off on the wrong track? Dick Worthland was President Reagan's pollster back in the 70s and 80s, or Ronald Reagan's pollster got him into the presidency and while he was president. And Worthland sort of popularized this question. He used to call it the Dow Jones indicator of American politics, that it was just a great barometer of how satisfied people are with what's going on and whether they're looking for change. And the thing is, because midterm elections are uniquely an election on the status quo, you know, it's a referendum on the president to a certain extent, a referendum on the party in power, then this right direction, wrong track question is very, very relevant. And when you ask that question, typically right now you get in the 25 to 31 range, something like that. There was an NBC Wall Street Journal poll that came out earlier this week that had right direction at 27, wrong track at 60. And that poll is one of my favorites because it was done jointly with one of the top Republican polling firms in the country, Public Opinion Strategies. It is the biggest of the Republican polling firms, and by Peter Hart, who is one of the top Democratic pollsters, and in fact the largest of the Democratic firms, and they do it together. So there's not like any poll bias or anything like that there. So 27 right direction, 60 wrong track. When I was a kid, there was a TV show called Lost in Space. I don't know if it's been on reruns, but they used to have this robot with these sensors, and there was this character that would say, you know, danger, Will Robinson, danger, danger, and flashing lights and all that. That question is a danger signal that, wow, be very, very careful if you're the party in power. The second of the 2 questions that I look at is Congress's approval rating. The Gallup organization has found that when Congress has a job approval rating over 40%, that the average net change in the House is minimal in midterm elections, only about 5 seats, you know, which out of 435 is nothing. But when Congress has a job approval rating below 40, the average net change in the House in a midterm election is 29 seats. Well, when the majority in the House is 15, wow, that's pretty eye-opening. So what's what's Congress's job approval right now in this new NBC Wall Street Journal poll? 25 approve, 60 disapprove. And we're seeing most of our approval ratings right now for Congress are in the mid to high 20s, occasionally low 30s. And it doesn't matter whether you're talking about ABC or CBS or NBC or Fox, all the numbers are showing exactly the same and way, way, way under 40%. So that's another danger signal. The third one is what we call the generic ballot test. It's where you ask and there are 2 ways of asking it. One way is where you ask, if the election were held today, would you vote for the Democratic candidate for Congress or the Republican candidate for Congress in your district? And half the interviews they say Democrat first, Republican second, and half the interviews they flip it and say Republican first, Democrat second. And some pollsters ask it a slightly different way. way. They ask, which party would you rather see in control of Congress after this election? And the results are pretty much the same. And what we've seen is, either way you ask it, and what we've seen is a fluctuation. The very, very best for Republicans is Democrats ahead by 6 or 8 percentage points on that question, and the worst are 15, 16, 18, something like that. In this new NBC Wall Street Journal poll, the margin was a 10-point margin for Democrats, and that's probably about the average right now. And I cite the NBC Wall Street Journal just because it's a very recent, and because I also do some work for NBC. We're actually doing a poll with RT Strategies, a polling firm that we work with, that went into the field last night, and for Thursday, Friday, Saturday, Sunday nights, that we'll be getting numbers back on Monday, and it'll be in my Congress Daily column on Tuesday to see what it shows. But and now the thing is, this generic ballot test that we call it, it doesn't predict seats. It really doesn't. What it tells you is which way is the wind going, and is it small, medium, or large? And don't, you don't expect it to do any more than that. And what that's saying is, if it's 6, 7, 8 point Democratic advantage, that's pretty moderate. If it's a double-digit lead, shoot, that's real high. And finally, you look at the president's job approval rating, and it's fascinating to watch. From last fall, after Hurricane Katrina, you saw the president kind of slide down into the 30s, and I use 50 used to be sort of the benchmark between what's good and not good. And the further up you were from 50, that's great, and the further down you were from 50, that's bad. And that still pretty much is the benchmark, but now when you have a country that's sort of split 48-48, 50 is maybe a tad high. So high 40s is probably what you'd say is very high 40s would be okay. Mid 40s is not good. Low 40s is bad. But when you drop below 40, then you start getting, and to the extent that you drop below a 40% presidential job approval rating, it starts getting first radioactive or toxic, and then it starts getting just positively radioactive. And you get down into the mid 30s, and that's really ugly, okay? So the president had dropped down well into the 30s last fall, and then in around December, he popped back up above 40 and was above 40 for December, January, really the first couple weeks of February, so that where, maybe he was something of a liability, but not an enormous liability, for the Republican Party. And then starting about the second week of February, we started a slide. And it started sliding, going way, way, way down, all the way into May. And where it was getting down in some polls as low as 32, 33, 34%, which is like horrendous. And then you had a couple things. You had some good breaks in Iraq. You had Josh Bolten take over as White House Chief of Staff. The White House staff started executing a little more crisply. And I thought handling themselves, more proactive, doing things, getting out in front of stories better. And you saw the president kind of curl back up to sort of hovering around 40. And I like to use that as sort of a surrogate, that presidential job approval for how the party is doing. So we got to about 40. In fact, we had a string of polls where there were, out of 10 polls, 10 consecutive polls, 5 had him 40 or slightly higher than 40, and 5 had him slightly lower than 40, but he was sort of hovering right at 40. And then the last 8 polls we've seen, 7 out of 8 now have him below 40%. And of the 8, I guess it's 3 or 4 of them have him at 37, 36, down like that, which, not good. So it looks like they were not able to kind of sustain that little recovery period and have kind of slid back down now. And so the bottom line is, and so you look at this macro picture and you say, gosh, this is just absolutely horrendous, and it's the worst case scenario for Republicans. Okay, let's flip over and talk about the micro and talk about the Senate. For Senate, as you know, is split 55-45. If Democrats have a 5-seat gain in the Senate, it's 50-50. Vice President Cheney still breaks the tie, so Democrats need a net gain of 6. And the catch is that I can see in this political environment, and this is probably the worst political climate for Republicans since 1974, since the Watergate election when President Nixon was getting pushed out. I could see Democrats getting 3, 4, even a 5-seat net gain. But the problem is, where do they find the 6th seat? And to get that, they have to win the first 5, and I'll go through those in a second. Then they've got to win 1 out of the next 3 that are much, much harder than the first 5. Then they have to hold on and not lose to any of their own seats whatsoever. Wow. That's really kind of hard. Now, what are the first 5? And look, in this business, you never want to say never, and it's a fluid business. But I think the single most vulnerable Republican seat is clearly Senator Santorum in Pennsylvania. He's been up behind for basically a year and a half. Some polls have it closing a little bit, some don't. That's a very, very tough race, and I think even Republicans would concede that it's an uphill struggle for him right now. His opponent's not the most talented Democratic challenger in the world, but Santorum's behind. It's a very tough race. So that would be the first of the 5 that are really, really endangered Republican seats. The second is probably Conrad Burns in Montana, and it's not that Montana's a real Democratic state, but Senator Burns has sort of dug himself into a hole in a number of ways, including Jack Abramoff, and he's got some real problems. So that's the second seat. The third is probably Lincoln Chafee, who is a liberal Republican from Rhode Island. He's got a conservative against him in the primary. He may or may not survive that. Then he's got a very tough general election. I would say that's the third most vulnerable Republican seat. The fourth is Ohio with Mike DeWine, and you can kind of argue which is third and which is fourth between Rhode Island and Ohio. But, Mike DeWine, nice guy, hardworking guy, conservative, moderately conservative, hasn't done anything stupid, hasn't said anything stupid, hasn't done anything really to make himself particularly vulnerable, but they've had just some horrific scandals in state government in Ohio, and Ohio has been dominated for well over a decade by Republicans, and for example, there are 12 statewide elected officials in Ohio, including the state Supreme Court. At this point, all 12 of them are Republicans, so when there's a huge scandal in state government where the governor's job approval ratings in the last 3 polls I've seen have been something like 12, 17, and 20, or 18. I mean, just the worst job approval ratings I've ever heard of any elected official in any state for any office. When you have numbers like that, gosh, the question is just, is Mike DeWine collateral damage? I mean, if he were up 2 years ago, he'd have won in a landslide. If we're up 2 years from now, he'd probably win a landslide. But this year, wow, he's in a very, very, very tough race. And the fifth one is Missouri with Jim Talent. Another nice guy, very smart guy, hardworking, hasn't done or said anything stupid or anything. It's just that, he's up as a freshman senator in a swing, only slightly leaning Republican state in a really, really, really bad year for Republicans, and he's got a very strong Democratic challenger. And I'm not saying that necessarily Democrats are going to win all 5 of those, but, this moment, I would say they're ahead in every single one of the 5. Rhode Island's kind of borderline, but when you factor in the primary and the consequences of the primary, you could probably lift that one above 50-52. So that gets Democrats, if theoretically they won all 5 of those, that gets them up 5. But they still have to pick up a 6th seat and hold on to all their others. So they've got to win an open seat in Tennessee, which is the primary's next week, the 3-way Republican primary, but Bob Corker, the mayor of Chattanooga, is going to win it. That's going to be it's going to be a very, very, very competitive general election, and one that's probably slightly uphill for Democrats. And so, but that's the best of the 3. Then they've got John Kyle in Arizona with Jim Peterson, a Democratic real estate developer, multimillionaire, spending lots of his own money. And right now, Senator Kyle, the Republican, is ahead, but, not comfortably ahead. And that race is, it's up for grabs. I mean, do Republicans have an advantage? Absolutely. But is it insurmountable? No, it isn't. And then sort of the somewhat longer shot, or a good bit longer shot, is next door here in Virginia with Senator George Allen and former Reagan Navy Secretary Jim Webb. So Democrats have to find 6 or if they lose one of their own, 7 of those, and then hold on to all their own. And they've got some seats that they have to work really hard to defend as well. For example, Senator Maria Cantwell from Washington State has got a very tough race with a very, very aggressive, very strong Republican challenger running against her. They have open seats. They have to contest a very aggressive race in Minnesota, for example, open seat, and other open seats where they have, a little less problematic, but where they still have to pay attention, places like Maryland, for example, and a Democratic incumbent in Michigan, and maybe Nebraska that they have to worry, kind of keep an eye on and make sure they don't slip between their fingers as well. So you look at that, and Democrats have to win almost every conceivable, not quite every conceivable race, but almost every conceivable race to get a majority in the Senate. Now, there is kind of a domino effect in the Senate, and that typically the really close races tend to about 68 to 80% tend to drop one way, but they sort of need, even more than that to kind of drop when you, anyway, long story, but they need everything to go absolutely right for them to win a majority in the Senate back. Could it happen? Sure, it could. But it's not easy at all. In the House is much more likely to tip over than the Senate, but I think it's still sort of hovering above and below right this moment. I'd say the odds are a little higher that Republicans lose the House than hold on to it. 6 weeks ago, I would have said the odds were higher that Republicans hold on to it. That lead may change back and forth 1, 2, 3 more times between now and November, but it's kind of hovering above and below that 50-50 level. The structural things that help Republicans are, number one, the number of competitive races these days isn't nearly what it used to be. In the 22 years I've done my political newsletter, and I was involved in politics for a dozen years before that, we would typically see 80, 90, 120. One year we had 154 competitive House races where 1 out of every 3 seats in the entire country could plausibly have gone either way. In 2004, there were only 24. Right now, there are only maybe 40, 45 Republican and Democratic seats combined, about 10 Democratic and about maybe 35, 36 Republican seats that could conceivably fall the other direction. That's a real small number for Democrats to pull out a net of 15. I mean, do the math. Democrats would have to, in effect, let's say, hold on to all 10 of their own seats that are in varying degrees of danger, although none of them are in serious, serious danger, but they have to hold on to all 10 of theirs and then win, say, 25 of the, let's say, 36 vulnerable Republican seats. It's doable, but boy, it's not a gimme putt. I mean, it really isn't. It's a very close call. So there aren't that many Republican open seats, retirements this time. Half of those are not in seats that Democrats are likely to pick up. I mean, there are all kinds of sort of technical factors that tend to kind of offset some of this tidal wave. The bottom line is this, and I can say this because I am from Louisiana, is there's a hurricane coming, in November. And the hurricane, it's not going to be a Category 1 or 2. I mean, right now, all the signs are it's a 3, it's a 4, or it's a 5. If it's a Category 3, I think Republicans will lose a whole bunch of House and Senate seats, but frankly, I think they retain their majority. There'll be tiny majorities, but I think they retain them. If it's a Category 4, I think they probably lose their majority, not by a lot, but they lose it, but they retain their majority in the Senate just barely. And only if it's a Category 5 do they lose both the House and the Senate. And in the House, at a 5 level, maybe instead of 15, maybe it's 25 or 30, maybe it's 35. I mean, at Category 5s, I mean, I'll give you an example. I don't know how many of you live in the sort of the South, Southwest, Midwest, the tornado belt. But when I was a kid, I saw on the evening news, I grew up in Shreveport, Louisiana, and a tornado had hit in the Shreveport area, and they showed on television a pine needle off of a pine tree, and it had been driven into the side of a wooden house like a nail. It looked like it was embedded about 1 inch or 2 straight in, like you were hammering a nail in. A pine needle. I've also heard of pine straw, things like that, driven into the side of a house. And you think, how is that possible? Well, when you get into these Category 5 hurricanes, if it gets there, you see people that a party has never even thought about winning, candidates that the party didn't give a dime to, sometimes winning. I mean, it's like the laws of gravity are sort of repealed or suspended for one night. And in Texas, there was a race. There was a guy named Jack Brooks, and he had been the chairman of the House Government Ops Committee for forever, had just taken over the House Judiciary Committee. And Brooks, this was a district in Texas, and President or Vice President George H.W. Bush, Bush Sr., was at the top of the ticket. I'm sorry. In 1988, when Vice President Bush was running for president, Texas, right. But this particular district, it had a lot of oil refineries, chemical plants in it, very unionized district, very, very Democratic district, even though it was in Texas. Michael Dukakis, who was one of the worst candidates in American history, won, beat a Texan in this district by 8 percentage points, okay? And then 4 years later, Bill Clinton beat President Bush Sr. in this district by 8 percentage points. Brooks, the Democrat, outspent his opponent, Steve Stockman, by a ratio of 5-1 and lost re-election by 4 or 5 percentage points. That's like a pine needle into the side of a house. So I'm not saying it's going to get there. It could, but that's why you have to kind of step back. And you show me somebody who says, I know for sure that Republicans are going to hold the House, or for that matter, the Democrats are going to take a majority in the House. I know it for sure. And my response is that that person, male or female, ought to put on a short skirt and a tight sweater and carry a megaphone, because they're cheerleading. They're not doing political analysis. They're just rooting for their team. Or you could say white pants and white shoes if it's a male cheerleader. But anyway, but I mean, that's not, I mean, this is not open and shut for either side. It really, really, really isn't. So it's going to be a fascinating election. My prediction, though, is that no matter what happens in this election, that whoever has a majority in the House, whoever has a majority in the Senate, that those majorities will be smaller than the majorities that we see today. And that you're going to see the House and Senate, I mean, really, really evenly divided. And that it's going to be, and it's not going to be a fun 2 years, or it's going to be a fascinating but not a fun next 2 years. And that 2008, maybe we'll see a bigger, election where some of this stuff starts getting resolved, particularly with a new president coming in after then. So why don't I stop and open it up for questions or comments or accusations for the next 23 minutes? Yes, sir. That's a great question, is do I find it hard to stay nonpartisan? Not really, and part of it is because the reason I started doing this was a desire to be in the middle. And let me explain. I got my start, Louisiana, worked in a campaign down there, came up here, go to college, worked on the Hill, all that. And it was on the Democratic side, okay? And I worked in a bunch of campaigns, worked for a polling firm, managed a congressional race, did all these kinds of things. But in the early 80s, I found myself voting for Republicans almost half the time personally, even though I was working, for the Democratic Party or for Democratic candidates and things. And what I found was I wasn't becoming a Republican, I was becoming a swing voter. And I loved politics, but I didn't really want to work for either side. And half my friends were Republicans. And so I thought, how can I do this? What can I do that could allow me to stay involved in a job in politics, but not work for either party? And so I came up with the idea of a political newsletter. It used to be a print thing, now it's online. And came up with the idea of this newsletter that would handicap races independently, impartially, but from the standpoint of someone who had actually worked in campaigns, managed a congressional race, been a pollster, and from that standpoint as opposed to the standpoint of a journalist. Because even though there are some not that many, but some very, very, very good political reporters. A political reporter, by definition, is somebody who's never worked inside a campaign. And a lot of political reporters don't know a whole lot about polling. They know less than they think, and they don't know how to analyze polls very well, in my opinion. And so it was just sort of a different perspective. And so that's why I got into this. And as I say, I've got very close friends on both sides. I have Jennifer Duffy is the editor of the Cook Political Report. She's our expert on Senate and governor's races. Before she came to work with me, she was the deputy press secretary at the National Republican Senatorial Committee back in the 85, 86, 87, back then. Amy Walter, our House editor, was the political director of the Women's Campaign Fund. Before that, she ran one of the top, say, 10 congressional races in the country back in 1994 for a Democratic incumbent. But both of them were enormously professional, very analytical, and most importantly they knew this stuff inside and out, but most importantly, they knew how to park, whatever their own ideology or whatever their own partisanship, and very clinically, analytically look at these races, which is what you have to do. And I'll tell you what makes it easier. I'll tell you what makes it easy, and I'll tell you what makes it hard. What makes it easier is when you've got really good friends and good sources in both parties, you know that if you start tilting one way or the other, you will disappoint and in some cases betray very good friends and some of your and good sources. And so it's sort of like, some of these people, they may disagree with my assessment, but I want them to know that I may be wrong, but I got there honestly. And it's wrong and it's not bias. Now, where it's hard is, let's say a candidate comes in, and I do some of the candidate interviews, but Amy and Jennifer do most of them. And we see, 100 candidates or more. Back in the good old days when you had lots of competitive races, we would see. There was one day we had 8 House or Senate candidates come through for hour-long interviews, each in one day. But when somebody comes in and they're just a flaming jerk, I think they're recording this instead of it doesn't matter whether they're a Democrat or Republican or a conservative or a liberal, they're an And then you have to work hard not to be biased against them, just because they have a severe personality disorder. So sometimes, that's when you actually have to work, but it doesn't really have anything to do with partisanship or ideology or anything else. That's just, so you have to constantly work at it. And frankly, I think a lot of people in journalism don't work, whether they're reporters or correspondents or whether they're editors or producers. I think there are a lot of journalists that don't work as hard as they should to park their own ideological partisan feelings at the edge. And I say this in terms of liberal journalists who lean to the left as well as some who lean to the right. They don't park it as well as they should. And that's disappointing. That's disillusioning. Well, I tell you what, let's kind of bounce back and forth. Okay, you are the farthest right hand in the room, and then I'll go to the farthest and kind of work towards the center. Go ahead. Oh, yeah, no, that's a great question. It sort of follows on. I started to kind of tack this on to the other one, and I thought, well, if somebody's interested, they'll ask. I think that different kinds of people tend to go into different professions. And I think that people that tend to be inherently conservative tend to gravitate more towards occupations in military, engineering, hard sciences, and business. And I think that people who have a natural tendency to be liberal tend to gravitate towards certain other certain other professions. I think if you did a study, I bet, of college students, recent college graduates, and you looked at their ideology and partisanship, and you looked at what they majored in college, I think you'd see some pretty big differences, just that. And so I think people I think that are more journalists either Democrats or leaning towards Democrats than Republicans or leaning towards Republicans? No question. If you ask a series of ideological questions, do more journalists take liberal positions more than conservative positions? Most, not 100%, but absolutely no question about it. And there was a famous survey back in 1988 that, I can't remember what it was, but some incredibly high percentage of journalists, of Washington journalists, said that they voted for Dukakis over Vice President Bush. First of all, my own answer, somebody asked me that question, is to tell them to go stick it, that I don't tell anybody how I vote ever. But I think that fundamentally it's true. But I think it's only a problem if people let it seep through and affect what they do and what they write, the segments they produce, that sort of thing. And I do think it's a problem. However, I also think that it's a problem when other publications, news organizations seek to compensate for a perceived liberal bias elsewhere and overcompensate and go way too far the other direction as well. I think bias is bad whether it's left or right. And while there's probably a bigger problem of more journalists in Washington certainly having a more liberal or Democratic bias than conservative and Republican, but sometimes I think that some of the more, without naming any names or news organizations, boy, they seem to try to make up for it all in one news organization or two or three or something like that. But I think it's a problem, to be honest, all the way around, and that troubles me. Now, if you're a hardcore liberal, then you think the Washington Post or the New York Times or CNN, they're just not nearly liberal enough, And if you're conservative, then you may not think Fox or the Washington Times is conservative enough, because you have people that just are purists. And I think too often we have a problem of anybody that disagrees with you, they're not wrong, they're biased. Well, that's kind of, I think that's a wrong way to look at things. And that people are very quick to challenge the motives there was some guy on a liberal website a couple weeks ago was attacking me as a Republican hack. This person obviously had no earthly idea what they were talking about, But I've got, actually this morning, one U.S. Senate campaign on the Democratic side who was just absolutely ballistic at me for a quote that I gave the Financial Times that was in this morning's paper. So, as long as both sides are fairly, as long as there's a 12-month moving average of both sides being mad at me about equally, then I know I'm probably doing my job right. Whenever one side is happy with me for any extended period of time, I know I've made a mistake. I've screwed up someplace. Who else? Okay, let's go. We're going to go here. Yes, sir. What do I think accounts for President Bush's low approval ratings? It's a couple things. Obviously the war in Iraq is huge, and there's, the segment. You start with segments. There's, one group of people that thought it was wrong from the get-go. Then you have a group of people who were at the time supportive, but have now changed their mind, and then, but are still blaming somebody that at the time agreed with the position that they then had, and then you have people who, were for it, are for it, but don't think we've handled it well. Think we should have gone in with more troops. Maybe think we should have done this or that or whatever. They don't think the war has been conducted properly, although I'm hastened to add that I am actually glad that 99.999% of the criticism of this war has been aimed at political and civilian leaders and decisions, and not at the men and women that are actually wearing the uniform, because that's real different from Vietnam. You know, when I was in college at Georgetown was the tail end of the Vietnam War, and there were occasions where guys with very, very, very short hair who were obviously in the military walking down M Street or Wisconsin Avenue in Georgetown on a Friday or Saturday night would get spit on, and maybe not even by a guy. And that, boy, that was just so wrong, because those poor, you know, they may very well have gotten drafted. I mean, they didn't decide to go to war there. You know, I mean, they you know, they may not. I mean, wasn't their decision, wasn't their fault, and so this is very different. I think that's actually very, very good. But the war in Iraq is a lot of it. The economy is part of it, and the economy is defined by not so much GDP growth rate. Although actually the economy is, we had some new GDP figures come out this morning, and the economy grew at 5.6% in the first quarter, which is fabulous. But this quarter, this most recent, the preliminary numbers are 2.5, so it is slowing down a good bit. But I defined it as a lot of people out there, working class, middle class people, are working really, really hard, and they're working a lot of overtime, or in some cases working 2 or 3 jobs, but they're working their tails off, and they don't see themselves as getting ahead. And they see it like they're on a treadmill. Or what are the things that rats and mice are on? Hamsters? Is that a treadmill? A hamster wheel. They feel like they're that, where they're just not making any progress. Yeah, that's a good term as any. Like they're not making any progress. So there's a lot of that. You know, you throw in gasoline prices, and while, you know, I don't think there are that many people who actually blame President Bush for gasoline prices being high or think he can do a lot about it, but let's face it, you know, if you're paying above $3 a gallon for gasoline and it's eating into your disposable income, that makes you unhappy. And if you are unhappy, you're more likely to take it out on whoever's in power, whether they had anything to do with it or not. So there's that as well. Healthcare costs and availability. You know, there are all kinds. You know, immigration. There are all kinds of issues that are out there that are sort of eroding. But I also think, though, that for presidents, President Reagan in 1988 was a real. Let me answer it a different way. 5 times since the end of World War II, we've had a party in power for 8 consecutive years, and 4 times out of 5, that party was not able to win a third consecutive term. After 8 years of Eisenhower in power, Vice President Richard Nixon was not able to hold on, and Senator John Kennedy won. After 8 years of Kennedy Johnson, Vice President Hubert Humphrey was not able to hold on and win a third term for Democrats, and former Vice President Richard Nixon won. 8 years of Nixon Ford, President Ford was not able to hold on, and former Georgia Governor Jimmy Carter won. Served 1 term, then lost to former California Governor Ronald Reagan. Now I'm going to skip over Reagan and come back to him. 8 years of Bill Clinton, Vice President Gore was not able to hold on, George W. Bush won. The only time that a party won a third consecutive term since the end of World War II was after 8 years of Reagan. Now, after 8 years of Reagan, President Reagan had a job approval rating that was sort of in the low to mid 50s. Now, that may not sound terribly impressive, but when you've been in office for 8 years and you've made 10 zillion decisions and stepped on toes and stuff, being in the 50s is pretty darn good. And so the time for a change sentiment, the right direction, wrong track numbers, that kind of thing, probably wasn't that high. But at the same time, Democrats nominated Michael Dukakis, who was sort of a flawed and weak Democratic nominee. And so whatever time for a change sentiment that was out there, Democrats were not able to capitalize on. But the point is that after 8 years of one party in power, 4 times out of 5, the American people voted for change. And when you get to in the last, year 6, 7, 8, the American people start getting antsy with one party in power, particularly when they have the House, the Senate, and the presidency. And it's like every farmer knows every once in a while you need to rotate the crops in the field. And if you're a driver, you need to rotate the tires on your car. After a period of time, there's a tendency in politics, particularly with the presidency and with governorships, to want to rotate the crops and to sort of vote for change. And for example, anybody here from Indiana? Okay. I mean, Indiana's fundamentally a Republican state, right? Democrats had the governorship for 16 years, 16 consecutive years, which is mind-boggling. And Mitch Daniels, the current governor, he's having his problems, but he's an old friend of mine, and he ran a great campaign. But you know what? I think Democrats, I mean, could have nominated, um, um, Smokey the Bear, and they were going to win last time because people were just sort of ready for change. I mean, they were just ready for change that year, and they were going to switch back toward, and put Republicans in. And my hunch is that in Ohio, that's probably true this time. If any of you are from Ohio, that this sort of time for a change and some scandals together is that you're very likely to see the governorship there change, where it's just this time for a change thing that builds up. So it's a combination of economy, Iraq, a few other issues, and there's just this time for a change sentiment that's out there. Now, who's over on this side? Okay, here you go. Well, I think that if I were a Republican candidate, I would very carefully, very carefully create some distance, but you have to do it carefully. And what you'd have to do is, I mean, first of all, if a Republican starts dumping all over President Bush in the White House, it doesn't accomplish anything. First of all, you offend your own people, and you tend to drive down your own party's vote, your turnout, and it generally doesn't win anybody over anyway, because people look at you like they may. I mean, let's say you're a Democratic-leaning independent, and you may look at them and say, "Well, I don't like President Bush either, but you know what? I think you're just an opportunist and disloyal person." And so that does get you. But what you have to do is say, I agree, I vote with the president when I think I'm right, he's right, and I vote with him against his wrong. And for example, I saw an ad that a Republican Senate or House candidate is about to put on the air that they let us see before it went on the air, and where this candidate goes through specific votes and issues where he's disagreed with President Bush. And interesting would just say, I vote my conscience. I vote what I think is right. And there's a right way to do it, and there's a wrong way. And if I were a Republican candidate, would I do it if I were in a competitive race? And depending upon the circumstances, yeah. But I would do it very carefully so that you're not looking as disloyal as much as, look, I'm my own person, and I'm going to do what I think is right, and I think I'm going to do what I think is in the best interest of my constituents. That I'm not a robot that just votes lockstep. And Democrats had to do that occasionally under Clinton, and Republicans are going to have to do that, this time in a lot of circumstances. But it's very, very careful, very artful, and it's singing. A lot of times you'll hear people say, "Well, I vote the man or the woman and not the party." And now, deep down, a lot of those people do tend to vote more one way or more the other, but where they cherish their independence to a certain degree. And what you want to do is play to that. How about, no, you're already done. Okay, on the first row. Yeah, go ahead. Why have there been fewer competitive races, and why were there only 24 competitive races in 2004? Part of it, now a lot of people would say, well, it's all redistricting and gerrymandering, which used to be pronounced gerrymandering. I think that's part of it, but it's not all of it. Now, it is part of it. That increasingly in the last, I would say, the 90s and 2000, redistricting, that what we've seen is more, I mean, there's always been partisanship in drawing congressional district lines and state legislative lines, but I think increasingly we've started seeing more and more of these designer boutique districts. You know, one's designed for a Democrat, one's designed for a Republican. This is a Democrat, this is a Republican. So there's very few that are left that are truly up for grabs anymore, and that's just happening more and more and more. That's part of it. And then part of it is, as a result of the Voting Rights Act, creating where the Voting Rights Act strongly encourages the creation of minority districts, which is fine, but when you tend to concentrate minority votes above the 60, 70, you know, in some cases 80, 90% level, what that does is it tends to make all the adjacent districts extremely white and much more Republican. In fact, there's a terrible term called bleaching, where in effect it bleaches out the adjacent districts so that what you end up with is one or two inner city districts that Democrats couldn't lose no matter what because they're very heavily minority, but every minority person practically for 40 miles around has been packed into these one or two districts so that all the rest of them are extremely white and go Republican, and it creates that. So part of it is partisan redistricting, part of it is a result of the Voting Rights Act, but another part of it, and part of it is just, but part of it also is that I think incumbents have mastered the art of reelection, particularly House incumbents. And when I first worked in my first campaign back in 1972, a U.S. Senate race, back in those days, if you were a U.S. Senate, if you were an incumbent, you know, the cardinal rule in those days was this: you and your campaign should never, ever, ever mention your challenger's name. Because if you do, you give that challenger name recognition, you give them credibility, you elevate their stature, and it suggests that you're worried, that you're wounded, that you have something to worry about. Well, the people that truly believed in that soon became known as former members of Congress because they lost. Because you started seeing in the late 70s and in the 80s a ratcheting up of very negative, hard-hitting ads based on voting records and things like that, so that you started seeing incumbents dropping like flies, and they started realizing, gosh, I'm a sitting duck here. They're attacking me. I'm not attacking them back. And so now incumbents, smart incumbents, what you do is as soon as you see that your challenger has a pulse, I mean just has a pulse, there's any chance in the world of your opponent getting up off the ground, then what you do is you get up really close to them and you kick them in the teeth as hard as you possibly can, and you do it 5 more times, and then you move slightly around to your right and you kick them in the side of the head, and then you work your way down the rib cage, the rear end, come back around the other side, and you keep doing that all the way up through Election Day. And you never let them get up off the mat, and you try to destroy their credibility before they get any momentum. And it's you know, the League of Women Voters will condemn you, and all the editorial boards will condemn you, and people will wring their hands and say you're setting a horrible example for young people and this, but you know what? That unless you are in an enemy territory district, or unless there is a tidal wave against your party, or unless you're in a horrible Duke Cunningham-like scandal, you are going to get reelected. And so it's a combination of redistricting and incumbents maximizing their resources, and the fact that that's a lot of it. But also we're just sort of due. I mean, 4 out of 5 elections. You know, there was a Democratic speaker years ago named Tip O'Neill from Massachusetts, and he's the one that coined the phrase, all politics is local. You know, who are the candidates? What's the state or district like? What are the local issues? What's going on is most important. And the thing is, I would amend that where I would say all politics is local, except where it's not. And 4 out of 5 elections, all politics is relatively local. I mean, where it's how good are the candidates and what's the district like and all that kind of stuff is what drives it. But 1 out of 5 elections isn't local at all, because that's when you see these big tidal waves come in. And certainly 1994 was one. The 1980 Reagan landslide over Jimmy Carter created another one in Congress. And 1982 was a little bitty one in favor of Democrats when we went into a recession. 1974 in favor of Democrats. 1966 in favor of Republicans. 1964 in favor of Democrats. 1958 in favor of Democrats. So, I mean, we have these every few years. We'll have once every 10 years or so, we will have one of these these tidal wave elections where all politics isn't local. So. Okay, let me do a couple quick ones because we're about running out of time. Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, the thing is, we went through a period where values issues, cultural issues was on the ascendancy and became incredibly important. And where Republicans were particularly good, I mean, first of all, we had gone through a long time, particularly in the South and to a certain extent small-town rural America, where Democrats were holding on to the votes of some people that were culturally very, very conservative, and the party had sort of moved more liberally, but these people were still voting Democratic, even though there were some issues where they really pretty strongly disagreed with the party. And so Republicans, I think, very adroitly exploited that and sort of chipped out. And so, for example, you used to have, when I came to town, Democrats had a ton of very conservative districts in the South that you could argue about whether Democrats should have represented them, and maybe they shouldn't have, but where Republicans were able to sort of sandblast them out of the Democratic column and not bring them over to the Republican side. And so they used them very, very, very skillfully. I think in this election, there is a danger in trying to make sure that their people turn out in big numbers, that Republicans pander too far to the right on cultural issues and alienate a lot of what I would call secular Republicans. And these are Republicans who either A, don't care a whole lot about social cultural issues, and maybe they're kind of upset that the budget's so far out of balance and stuff like that, or maybe they even think that, well, you know, they're pro-stem cell research and pretty aggressively, pretty strongly pro. And so if you divided up the electorate into, you know, very liberal, somewhat liberal, middle of the road, somewhat conservative, very conservative, I think the weak spot for Republicans in this election isn't getting the very, very conservative people out to vote. I think it's holding on to the Republicans that aren't that conservative and the secular Republicans that are more into economic and cultural issues. I think that they have a real problem with losing some of those people. But you're absolutely right that just because you have an opinion on an issue doesn't mean you vote on it. And take the abortion, or if you're on that side, the choice issue, okay? Because we get into terminology. And in my newsletter, what we have chosen to use is we give each side the term that they choose for themselves. And so we say a candidate is pro-choice, or we say the candidate is pro-life. Because I think if you say someone is pro-abortion, well, I don't know anybody that's pro-abortion, but if you say somebody's anti-choice, well, you know, so we allow people to define themselves as sort of a less judgmental way of doing it. But anyway, to get the point, you know, you look at the American people, and any given time, between maybe 7, 8, 9, 10% are pro-choice, and they vote on it. And I would say 6, 7, 8 are pro-life, and they vote on it. And that 70% of the American people have an opinion on that issue, but it's not something that's their primary, certainly not a single issue focus for them, interest in them. And just because you have an opinion doesn't mean that you vote on it. And so I think you're absolutely right that you have to decide to discern not only how someone sees an issue, but whether that's the kind of issue that is the deal breaker that if I agree with the candidate on everything else except that, that's going to really affect my vote. Because there aren't that many of those out there, and not that many of those people that are out there. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure I know which articles you're talking about, but I mean, I think there's always been a debate about to what extent should politicians and elected officials allow polls and, to affect their decisions. And that debate's been going on, for 40 years, as long as there have been polls. It's not a new debate. Well, I just say it's that's really an ongoing fight that I can remember when I was an intern and sitting, in these chairs. I don't feel like I'm answering your question though. I mean, I think that there are some huge problems in the polling business because I think even the very best pollsters, Republican or Democrat, I think their polls, a lot of polls are not as accurate as they used to be because it's a lot harder to get people on the phone. That you go back 15, 20, 30 years ago when there was very little telemarketing, there were no caller IDs, nobody had cell phones. It wasn't hard to get a good representative sample of the American people. Today, with people getting bombarded, less so now with the new telemarketing law, but still you get charitable groups and stuff like that still calling. Caller ID, cell phones, some people not even having landlines at all. Pollsters, generally speaking, are not allowed to call cell phones. It's created some problems so that polling is not as accurate as it used to be. Internet polling is not perfected. Someday it may be, but I think right now it's impossible to get a truly representative sample. You show me an 85, 90, 95-year-old person who's on the internet, and I'll show you an 85, 90, 95-year-old person who's not representative of other 85, 90, 95-year-old people, that they're somewhat atypical. Certainly into low-income minority households, it's harder to get samples there. So, I mean, I think there's some huge issues in the polling business and all like that. But the debate and it gets back to a debate that goes back as old as our country is are you supposed to be a steward for the voter, for the people, where they elect you and you use your best judgment to do what you think is right? Or are you supposed to be representative of the people and reflect their wishes? And if you go back to the Founding Fathers, the House was designed to be representative, and the Senate was designed to be more stewards. I mean, as you all know, back in the old days, voters were not even, people didn't even vote on the U.S. Senate, that the Senate was picked by state legislatures, not by people. And they had 6-year terms because they were supposed to be able to rise above the passions of the moment and all that. And so we've obviously gotten away from that, but that's a debate that goes way back. But I have a sense that I didn't answer your question, but I'm not sure what articles you're talking about. Of what now? Okay, I didn't. Yeah. Well, I mean, I think that weak people and people without principle have bended to public opinion long before there were polls. And people I mean, look, I mean, does it happen? Of course it happens. Should it happen? It depends on whether you believe in representative or stewardship. Joe Lieberman is in the fight of his career in Connecticut right now because he chose on the issue of the war in Iraq to be a steward and to vote what he thought was right rather than take a poll and see what his constituents and particularly what Democrats in Connecticut thought. You know, and you know, he'll either win or lose, but it's an ongoing discussion. Last question, and then I've got to go. Well, that's a great question, and you're right, there's not a short answer. But I personally think that it would be better for Democrats to not get majorities in the House and Senate this time, and I think it's better for Republicans if they lost something barely this time. And let me explain why. Let me do the exceptions first. Look, if you've been sitting here in the House of Representatives for 12 years in the minority, you're obviously dying to get your hand on a gavel again. You just can't wait. You get more staff, you get to control the budget, you get to do, I mean, there are all kinds of stuff, and they're just dying to do it. And there's no way to convince these people, or most of them, that waiting 2 years is in their better interest. But to be perfectly honest, I mean, the chances of Democrats winning a majority where they could actually govern, where they actually could get anything done in this election is somewhere around slim and none. You know, more likely, if they get a majority, it's going to be just a hair of a hair's width. And so they will have the responsibility for governing and no authority to actually govern. And conversely, if you're Republicans, you know, certainly for the White House, it'd be an absolute pain if Democrats get the subpoena power in either the House or Senate, and to the point where they can start, you know, investigating things, and at the very least, just embarrassing the president and the administration and towel snapping and playing gotcha, or the worst, expose something, you know, truly horrendous if that exists. Obviously, for the White House, it's an enormous pain if Democrats get a majority someplace. But for me, and the reason I say it's better off for Republicans to lose something and Democrats to not win a majority this time, to get close but not a majority, is this. I think this time for Senate change sentiment, and keep in mind these, what was it, 27 right direction, 64 wrong track, which is very typical of all the other polls. Right now, the time for change sentiment out there is very, very strong. And let's say you've got a teapot on a stove or a pressure cooker, and right now it's like 75 pounds per square inch. And by election day, maybe it's 75, maybe it's 70, maybe it's 100, who knows, but it's going to be pretty strong. But if you let some of the steam out, release some of the pressure so that it doesn't continue to build, then the chances of that teapot or pressure cooker exploding, or let's say pressure cooker, less. But let's say it builds for another 2 years with no steam allowed to escape, as it usually does, historically speaking, in the 7th and 8th year of the administration, then 200, 300 pounds per square inch, it gets pretty strong pressure. And the chances of it blowing and getting the big bang. And let's say, for example, in the Senate, look, to me, if Democrats just had the best year of the entire history of the party, they'd get 52 seats. I can tell you, you can't do anything with 52 seats in the Senate. You just can't. You really can't. But the thing is, in 2000, and at that point, you have the responsibility for governing, but not the authority to govern. But let's say you go into 2008 with Republicans, the presidency, the House, the Senate. They have the total responsibility to govern, and because their margins are so narrow and the president's lame duck and perhaps weak numbers, Republicans will have no authority to do anything. Total responsibility, absolutely no authority. They can't get anything done in that scenario. The chances of the big bang happening then, I think, are quite high. And take the Senate, for example. In 2008, you have 21 Republican seats up that year, 21, and only 12 Democratic seats up in 2008. And so the possibility of Democrats scoring another 5, 6, 7 seat gain on top of, say, 3, 4, 5 this year and blowing the Senate wide open, holy mackerel, that's real. And in 2008, Democrats may actually get a bunch of decent candidates then, where now they don't have that many great candidates this time. If they win, it's just going to be because there's a big wave. Boy, so if I were Republicans, I'd rather lance the boil, let some of that steam off so that it doesn't build up and blow sky high and allow Democrats to get governable majorities then. If I were Democrats, I'd rather get just close enough that your team isn't despondent and isn't hugely disappointing, but close enough where it's like a gimme putt. And then it could blow big. But it's a great question and a huge debate on both sides. And I've got the Chief of Staff and Communications Director for a presidential candidate in my office in 12 minutes, 17 blocks away, so I need to get out of here. But anyway, thank you all very much and good luck to you. No, sorry I was late. Bye-bye.
I'm a Georgetown guy, too.
Oh, really? Excellent. There was one point we had 3 out of 4 employees at the Cook Political Report were from Georgetown.
Like, we need the run.
Yeah. Now it's only 2 out of 5. We'll see.